My name is Betty, and I am 69 years old. As a retired newspaper editor, I dedicated my life to uncovering local truths and fostering community bonds. For 43 years, I built my reputation on honesty, integrity, and the belief that every story deserved to be told completely and fairly. I supported my aging parents with unwavering love, treasuring every family story and memory they shared with me. I raised my children, Mark and Lisa, believing they understood the values I held most sacred: honesty, family, loyalty, and respect for the truth that shapes our family narrative. Everything I believed about our family was centered on my revered father, Arthur, a man I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. Then came the day I was organizing Dad's effects after his funeral, going through his desk with the careful attention of someone who wanted to preserve every meaningful memory. That's when I found the hidden box tucked behind a false back panel. Old letters tied with ribbon photographs of people I didn't recognize, and a birth certificate from another state that made my heart stop beating. The documents revealed that Arthur had maintained a secret second family for decades. A daughter named Eleanor, born years before Mark and Lisa, raised in another town with financial support he'd hidden from us for 30 years. Eleanor, this secret daughter, emerged from the shadows, demanding her rightful share of his estate. But the betrayal that shattered my soul completely was yet to come. My own children, Mark and Lisa, sat me down with faces full of guilt and confessed they had known about Eleanor for years. They had covered it up to protect me from shame, to preserve Dad's memory. 4 devastating betrayals in one moment: my father's secret life, my mother's complicity, and my children's years of lies. My entire past, my very identity as Arthur's beloved daughter, had been built on a profound deception. Yet, as Mark snapped at me, "You always glorified Dad like he was perfect," my newspaper editor's sharp eye for anomalies ignited a cold fury that surprised even me. What Eleanor, Mark, and Lisa didn't know was my secret weapon: extensive local newspaper archives showing Arthur's mysterious business trips and cryptic entries in his old fishing logbook that correlated perfectly with secret financial transfers. My forensic genealogist friend was waiting for my call. This time, their insidious conspiracy wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their blatant deception, clarify Arthur's true intentions, and redefine what family really means, no matter how agonizing the cost. The meeting that would destroy what remained of my family took place in Mark's sterile living room on a gray Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Dad's funeral. I had called the meeting hoping for answers, for some way to make sense of the devastating discovery that had turned my entire life into a lie. Mark sat rigidly in his leather chair, avoiding my eyes, while Lisa perched nervously on the edge of the couch tissue box already in her lap. But the presence that dominated the room was Eleanor, this stranger who claimed to be my half-sister, accompanied by her aggressive lawyer, Mr. Thompson, who had transformed what should have been a private family discussion into a cold, legalistic confrontation. Eleanor was 52 years old, with Arthur's distinctive nose and his habit of drumming her fingers when thinking. Seeing those familiar gestures in a stranger's face was like watching a ghost perform. She wore expensive clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, which made her claim to victimhood all the more jarring. "I want everyone to understand," Eleanor began without preamble, "that I'm not here to destroy anyone's memories, but my father owed me recognition and substantial compensation for 30 years of being forced to live in the shadows." Her father. The casual way she claimed ownership of the man I'd believed was mine alone felt like a physical blow. Mr. Thompson spread legal documents across the coffee table like weapons. Mr. Arthur maintained significant financial obligations to my client throughout his adult life. The current will fails to reflect those obligations or acknowledge Ms. Eleanor's rightful inheritance as his eldest child. Eldest child. The words escaped my lips in a whisper. Not only did I have a secret half-sister, but she was older than Mark. My son wasn't even Arthur's firstborn. Mark finally found his voice, but instead of the support I desperately needed, he delivered another crushing blow. Mom, we've known about Eleanor for 3 years. Dad told us when Grandma got sick. He made us promise not to tell you because he said it would destroy you. 3 years. My children had looked me in the eye for 3 years, sharing holiday dinners and family celebrations while keeping this monumental secret. Every conversation about Dad's legacy, every time I'd spoken proudly about our family's integrity, they had been lying to my face. We were protecting you. Lisa added, her voice thick with tears that felt more like manipulation than remorse. Dad was so worried about how you'd react. He said you'd never understand, that it would ruin everything you believed about him. Protecting me. I stood up, my whole body shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. You've been letting me grieve a man who wasn't real, letting me build my memories on lies. How is that protection? Eleanor's lawyer interrupted with practiced coldness. Mrs. Betty, your emotional distress, while understandable, doesn't change the legal realities here. Mr. Arthur maintained a 30-year relationship with his daughter, including substantial financial support, that demonstrates his clear intentions regarding inheritance. But it was Mark's next words that truly shattered me. His face had gone pale with fear, not fear for my emotional well-being, but fear of what this revelation might cost him socially and financially. Mom, you have to understand. Dad made this mess, not us. You always glorified him like he was some perfect man, but he wasn't. He had secrets, he made mistakes, and now we all have to deal with the consequences. But that doesn't mean we should let this destroy everything he built. The casual way my son dismissed my grief, the implication that my love for my father had been naive and misguided, cut deeper than any of Eleanor's legal threats. Lisa was sobbing now, but her tears felt calculated, designed to manipulate rather than express genuine remorse. Mom, we thought we were doing the right thing. This would have brought shame on the family. It would have shattered your faith in Dad, and we couldn't bear to see you hurt like that. So instead, you let me live a lie for 3 years. I said, my voice getting stronger as my anger grew. You let me write Dad's obituary calling him a devoted family man. You let me stand at his funeral and speak about his integrity and honesty. You turned me into a fool. Mr. Thompson sensed the family dynamics and moved in for the kill. Perhaps we can resolve this amicably. Ms. Eleanor is prepared to accept a settlement that reflects her father's intentions without requiring a protracted legal battle that would be painful for everyone involved. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression a mixture of entitlement and false sympathy. Betty, I know this is hard for you, but I have children too, and they deserve to know their grandfather's legacy. Dad always said he felt guilty about keeping us separate, that he wished things could have been different. Different how? I demanded. If he felt so guilty, why didn't he tell me? Why did he make my children conspirators in his deception? Mark stood up abruptly, his patience clearly exhausted. Because he knew you'd react exactly like this, you're making this all about you, Mom, when it's really about doing what's right for everyone involved. The room fell silent, except for Lisa's continued sniffling. Mr. Thompson began gathering his papers with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished his goal of destabilizing the opposition. "I think we've said enough for today." Mark continued, his voice taking on an authoritative tone I'd never heard him use with me before. "Mom, I need you to promise me you'll keep this family matter private while we work things out. We can't have this becoming public gossip that ruins Dad's reputation and embarrasses the whole family." "And if I don't agree to your demands?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from his expression. "Then we'll have to consider what's best for our own families," Mark replied coldly. "Lisa and I have children to protect. We can't let this situation create ongoing drama that affects them." The threat was clear: agree to their terms and keep their secrets, or lose access to my grandchildren. Eleanor smiled, with the satisfaction of someone watching her opponents destroy themselves. As I gathered my purse to leave, feeling utterly alone in a room full of people who shared my blood, I realized that the man I'd grieved for wasn't the only loss I was facing. I was also losing the children I thought I'd raised, the family I thought I knew, and the sense of identity that had anchored me for 69 years. But as I walked to my car, something else was growing alongside my devastation. The investigative instincts that had made me a good newspaper editor were stirring to life. These people thought they could rewrite history because they had legal documents and family secrets. What they didn't know was that I had spent 4 decades learning how to uncover the truth even when powerful people wanted it buried. And this time, the story I was going to investigate was my own. The war for control of Arthur's legacy escalated quickly after our disastrous family meeting. Within a week, Eleanor had begun what could only be described as a public relations campaign designed to establish her legitimacy as Arthur's true daughter in the eyes of our small town. She started appearing at places that had been special to Dad. The diner where he ate breakfast every Tuesday, the park where he fed ducks, the hardware store where he'd worked part-time after retirement. She would sit in his favorite booth, order his usual coffee, and inevitably strike up conversations with locals about her father Arthur and how much she missed their special relationship. He used to tell me stories about this place. I overheard her saying to Martha, the diner's longtime waitress. He said it was where he felt most like himself, away from all the expectations and pressure at home. The implication was clear. Arthur's real life, his authentic self, had been with Eleanor and away from his official family. Every conversation was carefully designed to plant seeds of doubt about whether the Arthur we'd known and mourned was the real man or just a performance he'd put on for our benefit. The local newspaper, where I'd worked for over 4 decades, ran a small feature about Eleanor's search for connection with her late father's memory. The article was factual but devastating, describing her as a woman trying to honor a father she'd known in private while respecting the grief of his other family. Mark and Lisa were panicking. Their carefully constructed image of respectability was crumbling under the weight of public curiosity and gossip. Mark called me 3 times a day, each conversation more frantic than the last. "Mom, you have to help us stop this," he pleaded during one particularly desperate call. "She's making Dad look like some kind of bigamist. People are starting to talk. This is going to ruin our family's reputation." "What would you like me to do?" I asked, though I could hear the bitterness in my own voice. "Lie for him, the way you did. Pretend this woman doesn't exist. We need to settle with her quickly and quietly," Mark replied, ignoring my question. "Pay her whatever she wants and make her sign a non-disclosure agreement. We can't let this drag on." But it was a conversation I accidentally overheard between Lisa and her friend Sarah that truly opened my eyes to how my children viewed this situation and me. I had stopped by Lisa's house unannounced, hoping we could talk privately about the family crisis. When no one answered the front door, I walked around to the back patio where I could hear Lisa's voice through the open kitchen window. "It's so hard dealing with Mom right now," Lisa was saying, her voice thick with the same tears she'd been crying since the revelation. "She just can't let go of this perfect image she had of Dad. It's like she wants to ruin his memory just to prove she was right about him being some kind of saint." "Can't you just pay the woman off and be done with it?" Sarah's voice replied. "That's what Mark wants to do, but Mom is being so stubborn. She keeps saying we need to face the truth and honor Dad's real intentions, but she doesn't understand that some truths are just too damaging to share. We're trying to protect the family, and she's making it impossible." The chilling clarity of that moment cut through me like ice water. My children weren't struggling with guilt or grief over their father's deception. They were frustrated with me for refusing to participate in another cover-up. They saw my demand for honesty as selfishness, my refusal to accept their lies as stubbornness. They had learned nothing from this crisis, except that family secrets were acceptable as long as they served the family's interests. The values I thought I'd taught them, integrity, honesty, the importance of truth, had never taken root at all. That night, alone in my house, surrounded by photographs of the family I'd thought I knew, I found myself remembering another secret I'd kept, another time I'd sacrificed my principles to protect someone I loved. 25 years earlier, my adoptive mother had suffered. What we now understand was a severe depressive episode, though at the time mental illness carried a stigma that could destroy families socially and professionally. She had disappeared for 3 months, staying with a distant relative while receiving treatment, but she was terrified that people would discover her weakness and judge our entire family. As a young newspaper editor with access to public records and community connections, I had helped create an elaborate cover story. I'd written fake articles about her visiting sick relatives out of state, arranged for friends to send postcards from her supposed location, and even convinced the local doctor to provide misleading information about her absence being due to exhaustion. The deception had worked perfectly. When Mother returned, everyone believed she'd been caring for a dying aunt. Her reputation remained intact, and our family's standing in the community was preserved. I had told myself I was protecting her dignity and her right to privacy. Now, decades later, I understood the terrible irony. I had used my professional skills to maintain a lie that protected my mother's image, just as my children were now asking me to maintain a lie that protected my father's image. The difference was that I had acted out of love and protection, while they were acting out of fear and self-interest. But the parallel was undeniable and deeply uncomfortable. How could I condemn my children for keeping secrets when I had done the same thing? When I tried to share some of these complex feelings with Mark, during our next conversation, his response was swift and brutal. "Mom, you're overthinking this whole situation. You always want to analyze everything to death instead of just dealing with reality. This isn't about moral philosophy. It's about protecting our family from unnecessary scandal. But don't you see," I tried to explain, "that living with lies eventually destroys the very things we're trying to protect?" "That's just your opinion," Mark snapped. "And frankly, your opinion isn't the only one that matters here. Lisa and I have children to think about. We can't let your need to be right about Dad's character destroy their futures." Lisa's response was even more devastating. When I called her hoping for support or understanding, she was clearly annoyed by my persistence. "Mom, you're making everyone miserable with this obsession. It's like you want to destroy Dad's memory just to prove some point about honesty." Some things are better left buried, and this is one of them. The accusation that I was trying to destroy my father's memory felt like a knife to the heart. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I was trying to understand the man I'd loved and mourned, to make sense of a life that now seemed built on foundations of sand. But my children had made their choice. They would rather preserve a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth. And they saw my refusal to join their conspiracy as a betrayal of family loyalty. The final blow came when Mr. Thompson contacted me directly with what he called a family resolution proposal. The offer was presented as generous, but felt like extortion. I could sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement about Arthur's secret family, accept a token inheritance that Eleanor would graciously provide from her father's true estate, and agree never to discuss or investigate the matter further. In exchange, the family's reputation would be preserved, Eleanor would receive what she claimed was rightfully hers, and we could all move forward without the messiness of public exposure or legal battles. Think of it as buying peace, Mr. Thompson explained with false sympathy. Sometimes the cost of truth is simply too high for families to bear. But I was beginning to understand that the cost of lies was even higher. As I hung up the phone after rejecting his offer, I realized that I was facing a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could surrender to their version of events and live out my remaining years, knowing I'd been complicit in a massive deception, or I could fight for the truth, even if it cost me everything I had left. The woman who had built her career on uncovering stories that powerful people wanted buried was about to take on the most important investigation of her life. And this time, the stakes weren't professional reputation or community standing. This time, the stakes were the truth about who I really was, and whether that truth was worth fighting for. The point of no return came on a cold Tuesday morning in November, delivered not through a tearful family conversation or heated argument, but through a formal legal document that arrived by certified mail. The letterhead belonged to a law firm I didn't recognize, and the language was clinical, brutal, and devastatingly final. Mark and Lisa, through their attorney, were officially severing all familial ties with me. The document accused me of emotional harassment, obsessive behavior regarding deceased family members, and refusal to respect family privacy regarding sensitive matters. The legal threat was explicit. If I attempted any further contact with my children or grandchildren, they would seek a restraining order. I would become a criminal in the eyes of the law simply for trying to maintain relationships with the people I had devoted my life to loving and raising. As I sat in my kitchen, reading the formal language of my banishment, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with my heart. It was deeper than emotional pain. It was the shattering of my fundamental understanding of what family meant, what love looked like, what kind of legacy I had actually created. My children weren't just choosing Eleanor's version of events over mine. They were choosing silence over truth, convenience over integrity, and their own comfort over their mother's basic human dignity. I had become an impediment to their preferred narrative, and they were removing me from the story entirely. But I couldn't let them erase me without one final attempt to reach whatever remained of the children I had raised. That evening, I spent hours creating something I hoped would remind them of who we used to be before secrets and lies had poisoned everything between us. I gathered photographs spanning 5 decades, Mark's first steps, Lisa's high school graduation family vacations, where we'd been genuinely happy, quiet moments of connection that had seemed unbreakable at the time. I arranged them in a small album with handwritten captions that captured not just what we were doing, but how much I had loved watching them grow into the people I thought they'd become. The letter I wrote to accompany the album was the hardest thing I'd ever written, not because I was angry, but because I was trying to reach across an abyss of betrayal and hurt to find whatever love might still exist beneath all the damage. My dearest Mark and Lisa, I began, I know you believe you're protecting our family by keeping these secrets, but I need you to understand that families built on lies eventually collapse under their own weight. I'm not fighting for Eleanor's money or against Dad's memory. I'm fighting for the right to know the truth about my own life and for the hope that my children might still value honesty and integrity above reputation and convenience. I left the album and letter at Mark's front door on a Sunday morning, rang the doorbell, and walked away. For 24 hours, I allowed myself to hope that seeing those photos, reading that letter, might remind them of the mother who had loved them unconditionally and the values she had tried to teach them. Instead, I discovered my final hope destroyed in the cruelest way possible. Mark posted a photograph on his social media page that made me physically sick. It showed my album torn apart and discarded in what appeared to be a garbage can. The photos I had carefully selected and captioned were scattered and damaged, and my letter was visible among the debris, clearly readable to anyone who cared to look. His caption was brief but devastating. Some memories are better forgotten, moving forward from negativity. In that moment, I understood that the children I had raised, the family I had believed in, had never really existed. Mark and Lisa were strangers who happened to share my DNA and my history, but who had never absorbed any of the values I thought I'd taught them. The public nature of Mark's post was the final cruelty. He wasn't just rejecting my attempt at reconciliation, he was humiliating me before our entire community, sending a clear message that I was unwanted, unreasonable, and disposable. Within hours, my phone buzzed with a text message from him. "Consider this closed, Mom. Don't contact us again, ever. You're causing too much trouble for everyone." Lisa's response was more subtle, but equally devastating. She began calling mutual friends and family members, spreading carefully crafted stories about my mental instability and obsession with the past. The narrative she created painted me as a grief-stricken woman who had become dangerously fixated on conspiracy theories about her father's life. "She's just not handling Dad's death well," I heard through mutual friends. "She's created this whole fantasy about secret families and cover-ups. We're worried about her, but she won't accept help." Eleanor, watching my family's destruction with satisfaction, sent me a text message that felt like salt in an open wound. "Looks like you lost Betty." Sometimes the truth really does set people free, just not the people you'd expect. But it was in the aftermath of this complete rejection, sitting alone in my house, surrounded by the wreckage of every relationship I'd valued, that the most devastating secret of all finally surfaced. I called Dr. Patricia Wells, the family therapist I'd started seeing to help process the trauma of these revelations. In her quiet office, surrounded by tissues and gentle understanding, I found myself speaking words I had never said aloud to another human being. "There's something else," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Something about my own origins that makes all of this even more impossible to bear." Dr. Wells waited patiently as I struggled to find the words for a truth I had carried alone for nearly 70 years. "Arthur wasn't my biological father," I finally said. "I've known since I was 16. My mother had a brief affair during a period when she and the man I called Dad were separated. When she realized she was pregnant, she reconciled with Arthur, and he agreed to raise me as his own. The irony was devastating. I had spent months fighting for the truth about Arthur's secret family, demanding honesty about his hidden relationships and illegitimate children, while I myself was the product of the very kind of deception I was condemning. They created false documents. I continued, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. A birth certificate listing Arthur as my father, medical records that supported the fiction, even involving our family doctor in the deception. I've lived my entire life as Arthur's daughter, knowing it was a lie. Dr. Wells leaned forward with professional compassion. How did you discover the truth? I overheard an argument when I was 16. My mother was sick with guilt, and she was confessing to Arthur how grateful she was that he'd accepted me despite everything. I never told them I knew. I spent 53 years pretending I didn't know I was living a lie. The parallel to Eleanor's situation was undeniable and sickening. I was Arthur's secret child just as much as she was, except that my secret had been successfully buried while hers had been exposed. I had been raised in legitimacy while she had been hidden away, but we were both products of Arthur's complicated relationship with truth and deception. The worst part, I told Dr. Wells through tears I couldn't control, is that I built my entire identity around being his daughter. Every principle I claimed to value, every stand I took for honesty and integrity was built on a foundation of lies I helped maintain. As I sat in that therapist's office, finally speaking the truth about my own origins, I realized that my war with Eleanor and my children had never really been about money or inheritance or even family loyalty. It had been about my desperate need to believe that at least some part of my life had been authentic, that someone in my family had valued truth enough to live by it. Instead, I had discovered that deception was our family's true inheritance, passed down through generations like a genetic trait. Arthur had lied about Eleanor. My mother had lied about my paternity. I had participated in covering up mental illness, and my children were lying to protect their comfortable version of reality. But sitting in that quiet office, speaking my deepest secret aloud for the first time, I also discovered something unexpected. The truth, however painful, had a power that lies could never possess. It was brutal and devastating and life-altering, but it was real. For the first time in my 69 years, I was living without the burden of a fundamental deception about who I was. And even though it meant facing the rest of my life completely alone, there was a strange freedom in knowing that whatever came next would be built on truth rather than comfortable fiction. The woman who had spent her career investigating other people's secrets was finally ready to investigate her own. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she understood exactly who she was and what her real family history looked like, even if the truth destroyed everything she had left to lose. The weeks following my complete banishment from my own family became a descent into a kind of hell I never could have imagined. The legal documents had been served, the restraining order was in place, and I was suddenly a stranger in the town where I had lived and worked for over 40 years. But the legal isolation was nothing compared to the psychological prison I found myself trapped in. I was alone with the most devastating secret of my life, the knowledge that my entire identity as Arthur's daughter was built on a lie I had helped maintain for over 50 years. Every piece of family history I had meticulously documented for the Historical Society, every genealogical chart I had lovingly created, every story I had preserved about our family's integrity and honesty. All of it was built on a foundation of deception. The irony was suffocating. I had spent my career as a newspaper editor and amateur historian, uncovering other people's secrets, but I had never had the courage to investigate my own. Now at 69, I was facing the reality that my entire sense of self was as fictional as any story I'd ever written. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every family gathering, every conversation about Arthur's values and character, every moment when I had proudly claimed him as my father. The weight of the lie pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. But my personal anguish was only the beginning. Eleanor and her lawyer, Mr. Thompson, had launched a systematic campaign to destroy what remained of my reputation and credibility in the community. It started with subtle rumors spread through the local historical society, where I had volunteered for over 20 years. Word began circulating that I was experiencing some cognitive issues related to my grief over Arthur's death. Former colleagues started receiving calls expressing concern about my increasingly erratic behavior and unstable fantasies about family history. We're worried about Betty, I heard through mutual friends. She's been making some very strange claims about her father's life. It seems like she might be having some kind of breakdown and creating conspiracy theories to cope with her loss. The implications were devastating. My entire professional reputation had been built on meticulous accuracy and calm judgment. I had been the person other researchers came to when they needed help separating fact from fiction in family histories. Now I was being portrayed as someone whose grief had made her unable to distinguish between reality and delusion. One by one, invitations to historical society meetings stopped coming. Academic groups quietly removed me from their mailing lists. The local library, where I had given lectures on genealogical research for over a decade, suddenly had scheduling conflicts that prevented them from booking future presentations. The message was clear: Betty's judgment could no longer be trusted. She was just another elderly woman whose mind was failing under the stress of loss and change. But the character assassination was only one part of their strategy. The financial destruction began when Mark called my bank to express concerns about my mental state and suspicious activity in my accounts. He claimed he was worried I was being taken advantage of by scam artists, that my recent large legal expenditures were evidence of impaired judgment. The bank froze my accounts pending a competency evaluation. Suddenly, I couldn't access the money I needed to pay my legal bills, my rent, or even basic living expenses. My credit cards were canceled. My pension checks were held in escrow for my protection. Within 2 months, I was facing eviction from the small apartment I'd moved to after losing my family home. The legal fees from defending myself against Eleanor's inheritance claim had consumed what little savings I could access, and the mounting costs of fighting the restraining order were bleeding me dry. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday morning, giving me 30 days to vacate the premises. I had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no financial resources to secure new housing. At 69 years old, I was about to become homeless, but perhaps the cruelest blow was yet to come. I learned about it through a flyer someone had slipped under my door, an advertisement for a Family Roots charity fundraiser being held at the local community center. The event was being sponsored by Mark and Lisa and featured prominently in the promotional materials were my grandchildren, Tom and Emily. The flyer described them as young historians uncovering their true family story and promised an evening of embracing honesty in family genealogy. I couldn't stay away. Despite the restraining order, despite the humiliation I knew I would face, I had to see what they were doing to my beloved grandchildren. I sat in my car across the street from the community center, watching through the windows as my 15-year-old grandson Tom stood at a podium delivering what was clearly a carefully rehearsed speech. Our family has learned the importance of seeking truth in our heritage. His young voice carried through the open windows. Sometimes, the stories we've been told aren't complete, and it takes courage to embrace the real facts about our ancestry. 13-year-old Emily stood beside him with a laptop using technology to debunk old family photographs that included me. She pointed to pictures of family gatherings and explained how misleading documentation could create false impressions about family relationships. We're proud of our parents for teaching us to value honesty above comfortable myths. Tom continued looking directly into the television camera that was recording the event. Our true family lineage is something we can be proud of because it's based on facts, not fantasies. They looked so confident, so certain of their narrative, so proud of their parents for protecting them from the lies their grandmother had tried to spread. The children I had loved unconditionally, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and whose bedtime stories I had read, were publicly disavowing me on camera. The local news crew was eating it up, presenting Mark and Lisa as responsible parents who were teaching their children important values while dealing with a difficult family situation. The subtext was clear. These were good people managing the fallout from an elderly relative's mental breakdown. As I sat in my car, watching my grandchildren perform my erasure for television cameras, I felt something inside me die. Not my anger, that was growing stronger every day, but my last remaining hope that family love could somehow survive this nightmare. But just as I reached the point where I thought I might simply give up, something unexpected happened. I was packing my few remaining belongings, preparing for my eviction, when I found a worn copy of my favorite historical biography tucked between some old newspapers. I had almost thrown it away with the rest of my life's accumulation, but something made me open it one last time. Inside the front cover, I found something I had completely forgotten about. It was a note written on a small piece of paper in careful handwriting that must have been placed there years ago. Dear Mrs. Betty, the note read, I was one of your students in the community college genealogy class 5 years ago. I wanted you to know that you changed my life by teaching me to truly seek truth, no matter how deeply buried. Your passion for uncovering hidden histories gave me the courage to research my own family's past, and I discovered connections I never would have found without your guidance. Thank you for showing me that the truth is always worth finding, even when it's painful. A grateful student. The note wasn't signed, but it didn't matter who had written it. What mattered was that someone somewhere remembered the real Betty, the woman who had dedicated her life to helping others discover their authentic histories. Someone understood that my life's work had value, that my skills and integrity were real, regardless of what my children and Eleanor were saying about me. As I held that small piece of paper, feeling the weight of a stranger's gratitude and recognition, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just a delusional old woman creating conspiracy theories. I was a trained investigator with 4 decades of experience uncovering buried truths. And I had been so focused on defending myself against their lies that I had forgotten to use my greatest weapon, my ability to research, to investigate, to dig deeper than surface appearances and uncover the facts that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The woman who had spent her career giving voice to hidden histories was about to apply those same skills to her own story. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she had uncovered every secret, exposed every lie, and revealed the complete truth about who she really was and what had been done to her. The battle for my identity was just beginning. The systematic destruction of my professional reputation reached its climax 3 months after my eviction, when I learned about an event that felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything I had worked to build over 4 decades. I was living in a homeless shelter at the time, sleeping on a narrow cot surrounded by other forgotten souls, when a former colleague named Martha discreetly approached me with news that made my blood run cold. "Betty," she whispered, her face full of sympathy and embarrassment, "I thought you should know. Mark and Lisa are organizing some kind of academic exhibit at the university library. They're calling it Uncovering Truth in Local Family Histories. And from what I heard, it's specifically about your family's genealogy." The exhibit was being presented as a scholarly examination of how emotional attachment and cognitive decline can affect amateur historians' ability to maintain objectivity in their research. My own children were using my life's work as a case study in how grief and aging can compromise historical accuracy. I managed to obtain a copy of the promotional materials, and reading them was like watching my own professional execution being advertised as an educational event. Join us for an important examination of how personal investment in family narratives can lead to historical inaccuracies. The brochure read, "Local researchers Mark and Lisa Thompson will present recently discovered documents that shed new light on a family history that was previously misrepresented due to the researchers' emotional bias and cognitive limitations. They were presenting themselves as objective scholars correcting the mistakes of an incompetent amateur, the amateur being their own mother." The opening night was covered by local television and newspaper reporters. I watched from the homeless shelter's common room as Mark stood in front of display cases filled with what he claimed were authentic family documents that contradicted my previous research. My mother spent years documenting what she believed was an accurate family history. Mark told the camera with practiced sympathy. Unfortunately, her emotional attachment to certain narratives prevented her from seeing contradictory evidence. As professional researchers, we felt an obligation to correct these historical inaccuracies. The exhibits included birth certificates, marriage licenses, and property records that I had never seen before. Some of them directly contradicted documents I had found and verified during my own research. Either I had been fundamentally incompetent in my investigations, or Mark and Lisa had fabricated evidence to support their version of events. Lisa stood beside him, nodding with the authority of someone presenting scholarly findings. We've learned that elderly researchers often become so invested in preserving their preferred family narrative that they unconsciously ignore or dismiss evidence that doesn't fit their predetermined conclusions. They were describing me as if I were a textbook case of cognitive bias and aging-related decline, someone whose work could no longer be trusted because her emotional faculties had been compromised by grief and deteriorating mental function. But the most devastating part of the exhibit was watching my grandchildren participate in this public humiliation. Tom and Emily had been brought to the opening night, where they were interviewed by reporters about their family's commitment to historical accuracy. "We are really proud of our parents for having the courage to correct these mistakes," Tom said with the earnestness of a 15-year-old who believed he was participating in something noble. "It's important that family histories be based on facts, not just on what people want to believe." Emily, now 14, had prepared a presentation using digital technology to analyze old family photographs. She pointed out inconsistencies in dating and documentation presenting herself as a young person using modern tools to debunk the outdated methods of previous generations. Sometimes older researchers don't understand how to verify the authenticity of historical documents, she explained to the camera. We can use new technology to check if photos have been misdated or if family stories match the actual evidence. The subtext was clear. I was an elderly woman whose research methods had been superseded by younger, more technologically sophisticated investigators. My decades of experience meant nothing compared to their modern, objective approach to historical verification. The local news coverage presented the exhibit as a heartwarming story about a family's dedication to truth and accuracy, with Mark and Lisa portrayed as loving children who were courageously correcting their mother's well-intentioned but ultimately inaccurate research. It takes courage to challenge family myths, the news anchor concluded, but these dedicated researchers are showing us how important it is to let facts speak louder than family loyalty. As I sat in that homeless shelter, watching my children destroy my professional reputation on television, while my grandchildren smiled and participated in my humiliation, I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with sadness or anger. It was my faith in the fundamental decency of human beings, my belief that family love could survive even the most difficult truths. I was watching my own children systematically erase me from history while presenting themselves as heroes of academic integrity. But just as I reached the point where I thought I might actually lose my sanity, an unexpected ally emerged from my past. Dr. Samuel Chen was an elderly archivist who had worked at the university library for over 30 years. He had helped me with several research projects over the decades, and he had always respected my meticulous approach to historical verification. Dr. Chen approached me discreetly the next day, finding me at the shelter where he knew I was staying. "Betty," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something about that exhibit, something that happened years ago that you need to know about." He looked around carefully before continuing, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "About 15 years ago, I witnessed something that I never reported because I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Dr. Thompson, the family doctor who was involved in your birth records, came to the university archives requesting access to very old birth and death certificates from the 1950s. My heart stopped. Dr. Thompson had been long dead by the time I started my genealogical research. If he had been accessing those records 15 years ago, it meant he had been alive and actively managing information about my birth long after I thought the matter had been settled. He was very insistent about examining certain records privately," Dr. Chen continued. "He claimed he was updating medical files for long-time patients, but something about his behavior seemed unusual. He was nervous, secretive, and he specifically requested records from the time period when you would have been born." "What did he do with the records?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I'm not certain, but I noticed that some documents that had been in the files seemed to have been replaced with different versions when I cataloged them later. At the time, I assumed I had made an error in my original documentation, but now seeing this exhibit and knowing what your children are claiming about your research." Dr. Chen didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood what he was suggesting. Dr. Thompson had been actively managing and possibly altering historical records related to my birth potentially for decades after the original deception. "Betty," Dr. Chen said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder, "I've watched you work for years. You're one of the most meticulous researchers I've ever known. Your methods are sound, your documentation is thorough, and your integrity is unquestionable. Whatever your children are claiming about your competence is simply not true." For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair and humiliation. I felt the cold, focused clarity that had made me a good investigative journalist for 4 decades. If Dr. Thompson had been actively managing records related to my birth, it meant the deception surrounding my parentage was far more complex and long-lasting than I had realized. It also meant that there might be evidence of this manipulation traces of the original truth that had been hidden but not completely destroyed. The exhibit my children had created to destroy my credibility had inadvertently provided me with the most important clue I had discovered yet. They thought they were burying me under an avalanche of fake scholarship and manipulated evidence. Instead, they had given me the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy that had shaped my life from birth to old age. The woman they were trying to discredit as a delusional amateur was about to show them what a real professional investigation looked like. The final phase of my destruction began 6 months after the academic exhibit, when Eleanor and her lawyer launched what could only be described as a coordinated campaign to eliminate every trace of my existence and independence. Living in the homeless shelter had already stripped away most of my dignity, but I had managed to hold on to a few precious possessions, my research files, some family photographs, and the small inheritance from my adoptive mother that had been tied up in legal proceedings. I thought I had reached the bottom of what human cruelty could inflict. I was wrong. The lawsuit arrived on a bitter January morning, delivered by a courier who found me at the shelter's common room, where I was trying to write letters to potential allies. Eleanor was suing me for $150,000 for emotional distress, defamation of character, and interference with rightful inheritance proceedings. The legal document was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. It accused me of conducting a malicious campaign of harassment against Eleanor, of deliberately spreading false information about Arthur's character, and of causing severe psychological trauma through my obsessive and delusional behavior. The lawsuit wasn't designed to win money from me. Eleanor and her lawyer knew I had nothing left to take. It was designed to force me into legal proceedings. I couldn't afford to create a paper trail that documented my supposed mental instability and to provide a legal justification for isolating me completely from any remaining sources of support. But Eleanor didn't stop with the lawsuit. She began contacting every historical society, genealogical association, and academic institution I had ever worked with, expressing concerns about my mental competence and erratic behavior. I'm worried about Betty's ability to manage important historical documents, she would tell curators and librarians with false concern. Her recent behavior suggests she may not be capable of handling sensitive archival materials safely. For the protection of the documents and for her own safety, it might be best to restrict her access to research facilities. One by one, institutions that had welcomed my research for decades began turning me away. Libraries that had once sought my expertise suddenly found reasons why I couldn't access their collections. Historical societies stopped returning my calls. The academic world, that had been my intellectual home for 40 years, closed its doors to me completely. The isolation was devastating, but the financial assault was worse. The lawsuit triggered a review of my remaining assets, and somehow Eleanor managed to freeze the small inheritance I had been expecting from my adoptive mother's estate. The money that should have provided basic security in my old age was tied up in legal proceedings that could last for years. Without that inheritance, I couldn't afford even the most basic legal representation. The public defender assigned to my case was overwhelmed and disinterested, treating me like just another elderly client with delusions of persecution. My attempts to explain the complex family dynamics and financial manipulations were dismissed as the confused ramblings of someone whose mental faculties were clearly declining. The eviction from my modest rental apartment had been humiliating, but Eleanor made sure my next eviction would be a public spectacle. Somehow she had learned when I would be forced to leave the transitional housing where I had been staying, and she arranged for local media to be present. The news cameras captured me leaving the facility with my few remaining possessions in garbage bags, presenting me as another tragic example of elderly homelessness in America. But the coverage wasn't sympathetic. It was carefully framed as the natural consequence of an elderly woman's inability to manage her affairs and refusal to accept help from concerned family members. It's heartbreaking when seniors become so isolated and paranoid that they can't accept assistance, the news reporter commented as footage showed me struggling to carry my belongings to a taxi. Family members say they've tried repeatedly to help, but their efforts have been rejected due to the subject's declining mental state. Mark and Lisa were interviewed for the story, standing in front of their comfortable suburban home and expressing deep sadness about my situation. "We've offered to help our mother many times," Mark told the camera with practiced sorrow. "But she's become convinced that the family is conspiring against her. It's very difficult to help someone who sees persecution where there's only love and concern." Lisa nodded tearfully beside him. "We just hope she finds peace somehow. Mental illness in elderly people is such a tragic thing to watch, especially when it affects someone you love." They had crafted the perfect narrative. I was a mentally ill elderly woman whose family had tried valiantly to help her, but who had become too paranoid and unstable to accept assistance. My homelessness wasn't the result of their cruelty. It was the inevitable outcome of my own psychological deterioration. But Eleanor's cruelest masterstroke was yet to come. Using money from what she claimed was Arthur's real estate, funds that I was beginning to suspect had been stolen from my own inheritance, she purchased a luxury car and held a public ceremony dedicating it to Mark and Lisa as a tribute to their strength and vision in preserving family honor. The dedication ceremony was covered by local media and featured prominently on social media. Eleanor stood between Mark and Lisa, presenting them with the keys to a car that had been purchased with money that should have been mine, while praising their courage in protecting the family from destructive influences. "Arthur would be so proud," Eleanor said, dabbing at her eyes with perfectly timed tears. He always knew Mark and Lisa were the children who truly understood the importance of family loyalty and protecting what matters most. The photos were shared hundreds of times on social media with comments praising my children for their maturity and strength while dealing with such a difficult family situation. I was watching my own legacy being transformed into a celebration of the people who had destroyed me. The emotional and financial stress was taking a devastating toll on my physical health. The shelter was crowded, noisy, and unsanitary. I wasn't sleeping or eating properly, and the constant anxiety about legal proceedings and financial survival was making me physically ill. On a cold February morning, as I was walking to a legal aid appointment, the accumulated stress finally overwhelmed my 70-year-old body. I collapsed on the sidewalk outside the courthouse, my heart racing and my vision fading as everything went black. I woke up in the hospital emergency room, connected to monitors and struggling to understand where I was or how I had gotten there. The doctor said I had suffered what they called a stress-induced cardiac event. My heart had nearly stopped beating under the weight of psychological and physical trauma. As I lay in that hospital bed, barely conscious and completely alone, I experienced something that would later change everything. In my semi-conscious state, I began remembering fragments of conversations from my childhood that I had buried so deep I had forgotten they existed. I was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, lying in bed, but not quite asleep, when I heard my adoptive parents arguing in the kitchen. Their voices were hushed but intense, and certain phrases drifted up to my room with startling clarity. "She can never know the truth," my mother's voice said. "It would destroy everything we've built." "The doctor promised the records would never surface," Arthur replied. "But what if someone starts asking questions when she's older?" "Then we'll deal with it," my mother said firmly. "For the family's honor, for her own good, she can never know she's not really ours." Not really ours. Even as a 6-year-old, those words had penetrated my consciousness and lodged themselves in some deep, hidden part of my memory. But there was more. Another fragment from a different argument years later, when I was perhaps 12 or 13. "Dr. Thompson is getting nervous," Arthur said. "He's worried about keeping the secret so long. He thinks we should tell her something, prepare her gradually." "Absolutely not," my mother replied. "She's happy. She's secure. Why would we destroy that for the sake of some abstract notion of truth? Some secrets are meant to be kept forever." As these suppressed memories surfaced in my hospital bed, I realized that the deception surrounding my birth hadn't been a single act of desperation by young parents trying to solve a crisis. It had been a deliberate, ongoing conspiracy involving multiple people and lasting for decades. Dr. Thompson hadn't just helped create false birth records. He had been actively managing the secret for years, possibly for the rest of his life. My adoptive parents hadn't just told one lie to protect my legitimacy. They had built an entire false identity around me and were constantly vigilant about maintaining it. The woman lying in that hospital bed wasn't just discovering that she had been lied to about her parentage. She was discovering that her entire existence had been a carefully managed fiction, and that the conspiracy to maintain that fiction might still be active even now. As consciousness fully returned, and I stared at the ceiling of that emergency room, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for my financial survival or my family relationships. I was fighting for the right to know who I really was and for the truth about a conspiracy that had shaped every day of my life for nearly 70 years. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stronger than despair or anger. I felt the cold, determined fury of someone who had finally decided that no cost was too high to pay for the truth. My recovery from the cardiac event was slow and painful, but it gave me something I hadn't had in months' time to think clearly and plan strategically. The hospital social worker was kind, but overwhelmed, and the medical staff treated me with the professional sympathy reserved for elderly patients with no family support. But lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of medical care, I felt my investigative instincts returning with a clarity I hadn't experienced since before Arthur's death. The suppressed memories from my childhood had provided crucial pieces of the puzzle, and I was finally ready to start putting together a complete picture of the conspiracy that had shaped my life. Using my phone and the hospital's Wi-Fi, I began the most important investigation of my career. I started with Dr. Thompson, the family physician, who had been involved in creating my false birth certificate. If he had been actively managing records as recently as 15 years ago, as Dr. Chen had witnessed, there might be a trail of evidence I could follow. But I also understood that I needed to document everything I was discovering in a way that couldn't be dismissed as the delusional ramblings of an elderly woman in crisis. I needed proof that would be undeniable evidence that would force even my children to confront the truth they had been so desperate to avoid. Working with the hospital's patient advocate, I arranged to create a video statement documenting everything I had learned about my family's history and the systematic campaign to destroy my credibility and independence. The advocate, a young woman named Sarah, who specialized in elder abuse cases, helped me set up a camera in my hospital room. The video I created wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, it was a calm, methodical presentation of facts delivered with the professional competence I had developed over 4 decades of journalism and historical research. I played audio recordings I had made during family meetings where my children explicitly blamed me for their childhood problems and dismissed my concerns about Eleanor's claims. I presented the timeline of financial manipulation, the coordinated campaign to isolate me from professional communities, and the pattern of psychological abuse that had escalated over months. Most importantly, I included the audio recordings I had found among my adoptive mother's effects after her death, voicemails she had saved where she expressed deep guilt about the secrets she had kept, and her fear that Betty will never forgive us if she learns the truth about her beginnings. "This isn't about money or inheritance," I said to the camera. "This is about the fundamental right to know the truth about your own identity and about holding people accountable when they systematically abuse and isolate vulnerable family members." The video was compelling and well documented, a professional presentation that demonstrated my mental competence and investigative skills. Sarah agreed to help me send copies to Mark and Lisa, hoping that seeing undeniable evidence of their cruelty might shock them into reconsidering their actions. But Eleanor had been monitoring my situation more closely than we realized. She had bribed a staff member at the hospital to keep her informed about my condition and activities, and she learned about the video before it could be delivered to my children. What happened next was the cruelest violation yet. Eleanor obtained a copy of my video and immediately set about destroying it through digital manipulation and selective editing. Using professional software and the assistance of technicians she hired specifically for this purpose, she transformed my calm, rational presentation into something that appeared to be the paranoid rantings of a mentally unstable woman. She altered my tone and pacing, making my voice sound agitated and uncertain. She spliced sentences together out of context, creating statements I had never made. She added ominous background music and visual effects that made the video feel sinister and unhinged. Most devastatingly, she took my references to suppressed memories and presented them as evidence of confabulation, the psychological term for false memories created by people experiencing cognitive decline. The manipulated video was then sold to a national news program that specialized in sensational family drama stories. The segment was titled, "When Elderly Parents Turn Toxic, A Family's Heartbreaking Story." I learned about the broadcast when Sarah rushed into my hospital room with tears in her eyes and a tablet showing the news program's website. "Betty," she said, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief, "you need to see this, but I want you to know before you watch that this isn't really you speaking. Someone has taken your video and completely distorted it." The broadcast was a masterpiece of character assassination. The program presented Eleanor as a long-suffering daughter trying to connect with her late father's memory while dealing with harassment from his mentally unstable other family. My digitally altered video was presented as evidence of my psychological deterioration, with a voiceover from a psychiatrist explaining how elderly people often create elaborate conspiracy theories to cope with feelings of abandonment and loss. What we're seeing here is unfortunately common in cases of age-related cognitive decline, the expert explained. The patient creates increasingly complex narratives to explain why family relationships have become difficult, often casting themselves as victims of elaborate conspiracies. The segment included interviews with Mark and Lisa, who appeared on national television to express their heartbreak about my condition. It's devastating to watch someone you love lose touch with reality. Mark said his performance so convincing that I almost believed his tears were genuine. We've tried everything we can think of to help her, but she's become convinced that the entire family is conspiring against her. Lisa nodded beside him, adding, "The hardest part is that she was such a bright, capable woman for so many years. To see her reduced to this level of paranoia and confusion, it's just heartbreaking." The program even included footage of Tom and Emily, now 16 and 15, speaking about their concern for their grandmother's mental health. "We miss the grandmother we used to know," Tom said with the earnestness of a teenager who believed he was participating in something compassionate. "We just hope she can find some peace and get the help she needs." Emily added, "It's hard to see someone you love become so angry and suspicious of everyone who cares about them. We're praying she'll accept treatment." The broadcast reached millions of viewers and was shared thousands of times on social media. The comments section filled with people sharing their own stories of difficult elderly relatives and praising my children for their patience and maturity in dealing with such a challenging situation. I had become a national symbol of what happens when elderly mental illness goes untreated, a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing cognitive decline in aging family members. But even as I watched my reputation being destroyed on national television, even as I felt the crushing weight of having my own voice stolen and used as a weapon against me, I wasn't entirely without allies. Dr. Chen, the elderly archivist who had witnessed Dr. Thompson's suspicious behavior years earlier, had been quietly conducting his own investigation into the historical records surrounding my birth. When he saw the broadcast, he was outraged by the obvious manipulation and contacted a digital forensics expert he knew. Within days, he had irrefutable proof that the video had been digitally altered. The forensic analysis showed exactly where edits had been made, where audio had been spliced, and where visual effects had been added to create false impressions. More importantly, his research into Dr. Thompson's activities had uncovered evidence of systematic document manipulation spanning several decades. There were records of multiple visits to various archives, discrepancies in filing dates, and patterns that suggested an ongoing effort to manage and control historical records related to several local families, including mine. When Dr. Chen contacted Sarah, the patient advocate, with his findings, she immediately reached out to an elder law attorney who specialized in cases involving family financial abuse and systematic manipulation of vulnerable seniors. For the first time in over a year, I had professional advocates who understood that I wasn't a delusional elderly woman, but the victim of a sophisticated, long-term campaign of abuse and fraud. The video that was supposed to be my final humiliation had instead provided the evidence needed to prove that I was being systematically victimized by people who had access to professional resources and technical expertise. As I lay in that hospital bed, watching the news coverage of my supposed mental breakdown while knowing that powerful people were working behind the scenes to expose the truth, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of denial, but the steady, determined hope of someone who finally had allies capable of fighting back against forces that had seemed impossibly powerful. The woman they had tried to silence was about to find her voice again, and this time she would be speaking with the authority of documented evidence and professional support. The battle for my identity was about to enter its final phase. The federal courthouse in downtown Minneapolis had never seen anything quite like the media circus that surrounded my case. What had started as a family dispute over inheritance had become a national story about elder abuse identity fraud and the lengths to which people would go to bury inconvenient truths. My legal team was formidable and passionate. Sarah, the patient advocate who had first helped me document my story, had connected me with Margaret Chen, an elder law attorney who specialized in cases involving systematic family abuse. Working alongside her was Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic genealogist whose reputation for uncovering buried family secrets was legendary in academic circles. Together, they had built a case that went far beyond my personal situation. We were charging Eleanor, Mark, and Lisa with federal fraud conspiracy to conceal identity, elder abuse, and defamation. But more than that, we were exposing a decades-long conspiracy that had involved multiple people and institutions in maintaining a fundamental lie about my very existence. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and advocates from across the country who had been following my story. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, was known for her no-nonsense approach to complex family law cases and her particular sensitivity to elder abuse issues. But it was Dr. Torres who commanded the room when he stood to present what he called the most comprehensive genealogical fraud case he had encountered in 30 years of practice. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice calm, but carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades uncovering buried truths. What you are about to see is evidence of a conspiracy so elaborate and long-lasting that it redefined not just one woman's identity, but the very nature of truth itself within a family. The presentation that followed was methodical, devastating, and absolutely irrefutable. Using a combination of DNA evidence, historical records, and forensic document analysis, Dr. Torres had reconstructed the complete truth about my biological origins. The centerpiece of his presentation was a family tree that stretched across multiple generations, showing exactly where I fit into a biological family I had never known existed. Through careful analysis of public records, obituaries, and cross-referencing with DNA databases, he had identified not just my biological parents, but siblings, cousins, and extended family members who had never known I existed. Betty was born to Margaret Sullivan, age 19, and James Brennan, age 22, on March 15, 1954. Dr. Torres explained, pointing to documents projected on the courtroom screen. The birth took place at St. Mary's Hospital, but no official record of this birth was ever filed with the state. The reason for the secrecy, he explained, was rooted in a scandal that would have destroyed both families in the conservative social climate of the 1950s. Margaret Sullivan was from a prominent local family, and James Brennan was married to someone else. The pregnancy was the result of an affair that could have ruined reputations and destroyed careers. Rather than face social ostracism, Dr. Torres continued, the families arranged for the infant to be given to Arthur and Rose Thompson, who had been struggling with infertility and were desperate for a child. Dr. Michael Thompson, a family friend and physician, facilitated the illegal adoption by creating false birth documents. The courtroom was silent as Dr. Torres methodically walked through each piece of evidence: the falsified birth certificate that listed Arthur as my biological father, the hospital records that had been altered to support the fictional narrative, the web of lies that had required the ongoing cooperation of multiple people to maintain. But perhaps the most powerful evidence was a faded photograph that Dr. Torres had discovered in the archives of the local historical society. It showed my biological mother, Margaret Sullivan, holding an infant, me, with an expression of profound sadness and love. This photograph was taken 3 days after Betty's birth, Dr. Torres explained. It may be the only image that exists of Betty with her biological mother. The inscription on the back, in Margaret Sullivan's handwriting, reads, "My darling baby, I pray, someday you'll understand why I had to let you go." The emotional impact of seeing that photograph of understanding for the first time that my biological mother had loved me and grieved for me was overwhelming. I had spent 70 years believing I was unwanted, when in reality I had been deeply loved by a young woman who had been forced to give me up to protect both our futures. But Dr. Torres wasn't finished. His investigation had uncovered evidence that Dr. Thompson had continued to manage and manipulate records related to my case for decades after my birth. Dr. Thompson made at least 15 documented visits to various record repositories over a 40-year period, Dr. Torres testified. Each time he requested access to documents related to births and adoptions from the 1950s. In several cases, archival staff noted that documents appeared to have been altered or replaced after his visits. The implication was clear. Dr. Thompson had spent decades actively maintaining the lie, updating and altering records to ensure that the truth about my origins would never surface. When Dr. Thompson was called to testify, the weight of 40 years of deception finally proved too much for him to bear. Now, 87 years old and frail, he took the witness stand, looking like a man who had been carrying an unbearable burden for far too long. Under questioning from Margaret Chen, his composure crumbled completely. "I was young," he said, his voice barely audible through his tears. "The families were desperate, and I thought I was helping everyone involved. Betty would have a good home, the biological parents could move on with their lives, and Arthur and Rose would finally have the child they wanted." But as the questioning continued, the full scope of his ongoing deception became clear. "Did you continue to manage records related to Betty's birth throughout your career?" Margaret Chen asked. Dr. Thompson nodded, unable to speak. "Did you alter or replace official documents to maintain the fiction of Betty's parentage?" "Yes," he whispered. "I was terrified that if the truth came out, it would destroy everyone involved. So I kept managing the situation. For 40 years, I kept managing it." The courtroom was absolutely silent as this elderly man confessed to decades of fraud, document manipulation, and conspiracy. His medical license, he was informed, would be permanently revoked, and he would face criminal charges for his role in the ongoing deception. But it was Eleanor's reaction that provided the most dramatic moment of the trial. As the evidence mounted and Dr. Thompson's confession made her position untenable, something inside her snapped completely. "This is insane," she screamed, jumping to her feet and pointing at me. "She's nobody. She's not even really Arthur's daughter. Why should she get anything when I'm his real child?" Her outburst confirmed everything we had suspected about her motivations. She wasn't fighting for her father's legacy. She was fighting to ensure that the illegitimate daughter didn't receive anything from an estate she felt belonged exclusively to her. Security guards moved to restrain her as she continued screaming, her carefully constructed facade of wounded daughter completely shattered. The woman who had presented herself as a victim, seeking connection with her father's memory, was revealed as someone whose primary concern was eliminating competition for his assets. But perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when Mark was called to testify. My son, who had spent months portraying me as mentally unstable and delusional, was forced to confront the overwhelming evidence that everything I had claimed was true. As Margaret Chen walked him through the timeline of his knowledge about Eleanor, about his participation in the cover-up, and about his role in my financial and social destruction, his carefully maintained composure began to crack. "Did you know that your mother's claims about Dr. Thompson were accurate?" she asked. I thought she was confused," Mark stammered. "Did you know that your mother's research into her own parentage was legitimate and well-founded?" Mark's voice broke. I was scared. I was scared of what it would mean for our family, for our reputation. I thought if we could just keep it quiet, everyone would be better off. And then under the weight of evidence and the enormity of what he had done to his own mother, Mark broke down completely on the witness stand. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, looking directly at me for the first time in over a year. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything. I let my fear turn me into someone I don't recognize. I destroyed you to protect a lie, and I don't know how to live with what I've done." His breakdown was genuine and devastating, and watching my son's complete psychological collapse filled me with a complex mixture of vindication and profound sadness. This was the child I had raised with such love, reduced to this broken state by his own choices and the weight of his guilt. As the judge called for a recess and Mark was led away by court officers, I understood that my victory was going to be as painful as my persecution had been. The truth was finally emerging, but the cost of that truth was the complete destruction of the family I had thought I knew. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation delivered by a jury that had been visibly moved by the scope of deception and cruelty they had witnessed. Judge Williams read the decision with the grave authority of someone who understood the historical significance of the case. Eleanor was found guilty on all charges: fraud, conspiracy to conceal identity, elder abuse, and defamation. Her sentence was 8 years in federal prison plus full financial restitution for the money she had stolen and the costs of my legal defense. The judge noted that her calculated cruelty and systematic abuse of a vulnerable senior represented one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases the court had seen. Mark received 5 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy and the financial abuse that had left me homeless and destitute. His breakdown on the witness stand had been genuine, but it couldn't undo the months of systematic cruelty he had inflicted on his own mother. Lisa received a suspended sentence and substantial financial penalties, along with a court order requiring her to complete community service specifically focused on elder abuse prevention. The judge noted that while her role had been more passive than Mark's, her complicity had been crucial to the success of the conspiracy. Dr. Thompson, given his age and cooperation with the investigation, received probation and the permanent revocation of his medical license. But perhaps more importantly, his confession had opened the door to investigations of other potential cases where he might have been involved in similar deceptions. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive and largely sympathetic to my case. Headlines across the country read, "Grandmother wins fight for identity after decades of family lies," and "The ultimate elder abuse, how a family stole a woman's past." But despite the legal victory and public vindication, the personal cost was enormous. I had won the right to know the truth about my identity, but I had lost the family I thought I had. 3 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Mark in his federal prison. The handwriting was shaky, and the tone was desperate in a way that broke my heart. "Mom," he wrote, "I know there are no words that can undo what I did to you. I know that saying I'm sorry is meaningless after I stood by and watched you suffer, after I helped them destroy your life for the sake of protecting a lie I was too cowardly to face." The letter went on for pages, detailing his growing understanding of the magnitude of his betrayal and his desperate hope that someday, somehow, I might find it in my heart to forgive him. "I'm in therapy here," he continued, "trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could abandon his own mother to protect his own comfort. The therapist says I spent so many years avoiding difficult truths that I lost the ability to distinguish between love and selfishness." I read his letters. They came weekly, with a mixture of sadness and cautious hope. The man who had participated in my destruction was genuinely broken by what he had done, and he was working to understand and change the patterns of thought that had made such cruelty possible. But it was Lisa's response that gave me the most hope for healing. 2 weeks after the verdict, she appeared at my door with tears streaming down her face and her arms full of flowers. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I know I was a coward who let terrible things happen because I was too scared to face the truth. But I want you to know that I remember who you really are now, and I want to spend whatever time I have left making amends for the daughter I failed to be." Lisa's commitment to rebuilding our relationship wasn't just emotional. It was practical and consistent. She helped me find a small but comfortable apartment, assisted with the legal proceedings to access my restored inheritance, and most importantly, simply spent time with me. We began having weekly dinners where we talked not as mother and daughter fulfilling obligatory roles, but as two women who were learning to know each other honestly for the first time. Lisa was discovering that I had thoughts and opinions and experiences that existed independently of my role as her caregiver, and I was learning to share my authentic self rather than always prioritizing her needs over my own truth. The healing with my grandchildren was more complex. Tom and Emily, now 17 and 16, had been deeply traumatized by their father's imprisonment and the public revelation of their family's systematic cruelty. They had spent months believing they were supporting their parents in protecting the family from their grandmother's mental illness, only to discover they had been unwitting participants in an elaborate campaign of abuse. Their first visit to my apartment was awkward and painful. They sat stiffly on my couch, unsure how to relate to the grandmother they had publicly dismissed as delusional, now that they understood she had been telling the truth all along. "Grandma," Tom said finally, his voice cracking with emotion, "we're so sorry we said those things about you on television. We thought we were helping Dad, but we were hurting you." Emily, always more direct, asked the question that was clearly weighing on both of them. "Are you really not our biological grandmother? Does that mean we're not really related?" It was a fair question, and one that cut to the heart of what family really means. "I'm not your biological grandmother," I told them honestly. "But biology isn't what made me love you from the moment you were born. Love is what makes us family, and that hasn't changed even though everything else has." The process of rebuilding relationships with Tom and Emily was slow and required family therapy, but gradually they began to understand that their grandmother's fight for truth hadn't been about destroying the family. It had been about creating space for authentic relationships based on honesty rather than comfortable lies. Eleanor's fate was less dramatic, but equally devastating. She was serving her sentence in a federal women's prison where she had become known for her refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. According to reports from her court-appointed psychiatrist, she continued to insist that she was the victim of a vast conspiracy designed to deny her rightful inheritance. Dr. Thompson, now in his late 80s, had become a recluse in his own community. His confession had destroyed his reputation and opened him to potential lawsuits from other families who suspected their own records might have been manipulated. He lived quietly in a nursing home, reportedly spending his days writing what he called a memoir of medical ethics failures that would never be published. But perhaps the most complex situation involved Brenda Mark's wife, who had been the architect of much of the social media campaign against me. While she hadn't been charged criminally, her role in the conspiracy had become public knowledge, and she found herself completely ostracized by the community where she had once been a prominent social figure. Lisa told me that Brenda had moved to another state where she was apparently trying to rebuild her life under a different name. Her marriage to Mark hadn't survived his imprisonment, and her own children were struggling with the knowledge that their mother had participated in systematically abusing their grandmother. As I sat in my new apartment 6 months after the trial, surrounded by the few possessions I had managed to recover and the new items Lisa had helped me acquire, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 years: peace. Not happiness exactly. There had been too much damage for that. But the deep, profound peace that comes from finally knowing the truth about your own life, regardless of how painful that truth might be. I had my identity back. I knew who my biological parents were, why I had been given up for adoption, and how the conspiracy to hide my origins had been maintained for 7 decades. I understood the full scope of what had been done to me and why. More importantly, I had begun to rebuild relationships with the family members who were capable of growth and change. Lisa and I were creating something entirely new together, a relationship between 2 adults who respected each other's independence and authenticity. Tom and Emily were learning to love their grandmother for who she really was, rather than who they had been told she should be. The victory was bittersweet, but it was still a victory. I had fought for the truth and won, even though the cost had been almost everything I thought I valued. Now the question was, what to do with the life I had reclaimed and the knowledge I had gained through such painful experience. 3 years after the trial that changed everything, I stand in the kitchen of my small but beautiful apartment preparing dinner for Lisa and the grandchildren, and I'm struck by how different this life feels from the one I thought I was living just a few years ago. The apartment isn't large, but it's mine in a way that no home has ever been before. Every piece of furniture was chosen by me. Every photograph on the walls represents a truth I've verified. Every book on the shelves reflects my authentic interests rather than the image I thought I should project. At 72, I'm finally living as myself rather than as the person others needed me to be. The most profound change has been in my relationship with my own identity. For 70 years, I defined myself as Arthur's daughter, shaped my values around the man I believed was my father, and built my sense of worth on a foundation of lies. Now, I know that I am Margaret Sullivan's daughter, given up for love rather than abandoned for shame, and raised by adoptive parents who genuinely loved me, but were too afraid of social judgment to tell me the truth. I've spent countless hours researching my biological family, and what I've discovered has been both healing and enlightening. Margaret Sullivan went on to marry, have other children, and live a full life, but according to family members I've connected with, She never forgot the daughter she had given up. She kept a small photograph of me, somehow obtained through Dr. Thompson, in her jewelry box until the day she died. My biological father, James Brennan, struggled with guilt about the affair and the child he could never acknowledge. He became a dedicated community volunteer and children's advocate, perhaps, as a way of atoning for the daughter he couldn't raise. He died in 1987, never knowing that I had grown up just 3 towns away from where he lived his entire life. Connecting with my biological half-siblings, there were 3 of them, has been one of the unexpected joys of this journey. They welcomed me with curiosity and warmth, eager to share stories about parents I had never known, and to include me in a family history I had never been part of. The irony is that my biological family, who had given me up to protect me from scandal, embraced me without hesitation when the truth finally emerged. The relationship with Mark remains complicated and probably always will be. His letters from prison continue to arrive weekly, documenting his therapy progress and his growing understanding of how fear and selfishness had transformed him into someone capable of such cruelty. He's been accepted into a rehabilitation program that focuses specifically on people who have committed crimes against family members, and his therapists report genuine progress in his psychological reconstruction. I'm learning that what I called protecting the family was really protecting my own comfort, he wrote in a recent letter. I was so afraid of dealing with complicated truths that I chose to believe you were the problem rather than face the fact that our family was built on lies. We're not ready for visits or phone calls yet. The wound is still too fresh and the trust too damaged. But his letters show genuine remorse and self-awareness, and I hold on to hope that someday we might find a way to rebuild some form of relationship based on honesty rather than obligation. Lisa's transformation has been the most healing aspect of this entire experience. Our weekly dinners have become the highlight of my week, not because I need the company, but because I genuinely enjoy spending time with the intelligent, thoughtful woman my daughter has become when she's not trying to manage my emotions or fulfill expected roles. I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time, she told me recently. I always saw you as Mom, the person who fixed problems and took care of everyone. I never really saw you as Betty, the woman with her own thoughts and dreams and struggles. These conversations have been revelatory for both of us. I've been sharing stories about my journalism career, my passion for historical research, even my regrets about choices I made in the past. Lisa has been opening up about her own fears and aspirations, her struggles with motherhood, her career ambitions she had set aside to fulfill family obligations. We're building something entirely new together, a relationship between 2 women who respect each other's independence and authenticity. The grandchildren's healing has been remarkable to witness. Tom, now 20, is studying social work with a focus on family systems and elder abuse prevention. I want to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else, he told me. His understanding of how he was manipulated has made him passionate about protecting vulnerable seniors from family exploitation. Emily, 19, has developed into a talented writer and is working on a book about family secrets and the importance of truth-telling across generations. Your story taught me that silence isn't protection, she said during our last visit. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to keep someone else's lies. Both of them have become advocates for adoptee rights and family transparency, using their own experience to help other young people understand how family secrets can become toxic weapons. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation has been in my work. Using the settlement money from the lawsuit and the restored inheritance, I've been able to pursue my passion for genealogical research and historical truth-telling in ways I never could before. I've become a leading advocate for adoptee rights and transparency in family records. My story has been featured in documentaries, academic journals, and policy discussions about elder abuse and family fraud. I speak regularly at conferences about the importance of truth-telling in families and the devastating consequences of systematic deception. Most importantly, I've started a nonprofit organization that helps other adoptees search for their biological families and assist seniors who are facing family financial abuse. The work gives me a sense of purpose I never had when I was simply trying to be the perfect mother and grandmother everyone expected me to be. My memoir, The Truth About Family, One Woman's Fight for Identity, after 70 years of lies, became a bestseller and has generated thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories of family deception and abuse. Many of them are elderly people who had given up hope of ever learning the truth about their origins or getting justice for the treatment they've endured from family members. Your courage gave me the strength to demand answers about my own adoption, one woman wrote. I'm 83 years old, and I thought it was too late to find out who I really am. But if you could do it at 70, maybe I can too. These letters remind me daily that my suffering wasn't meaningless. It became the foundation for helping others avoid or escape similar situations. The quiet moments are just as meaningful as the public recognition. I spend my mornings reading in the sunroom of my apartment, surrounded by plants I've chosen and books that reflect my genuine interests. I take long walks in the nearby park, often stopping to chat with other seniors who have become friends rather than obligations. I've learned to enjoy my own company in ways I never could when I was constantly worried about meeting everyone else's needs and expectations. At 72, I'm finally comfortable with who I am, rather than anxious about who I think I should be. There are still moments of sadness, grief for the family I thought I had regret for the years I spent living a lie, sorrow for the relationships that couldn't survive the truth. But those moments are balanced by a deep contentment that comes from living authentically. Eleanor remains in prison, unrepentant and bitter serving, as a reminder of what happens when greed and entitlement override basic human decency. Dr. Thompson died last year, reportedly still working on his memoir of ethical failures. Their fates don't bring me satisfaction, only relief that their capacity to cause harm has been eliminated. As I prepare dinner for Lisa and the grandchildren tonight, a simple meal that we'll share while talking about books, current events, and their hopes for the future, I'm filled with gratitude for the life I've built from the ashes of the lies I once accepted as truth. I am Betty, daughter of Margaret Sullivan and James Brennan, raised with love by Arthur and Rose Thompson, mother, to Mark and Lisa, grandmother, to Tom and Emily, and advocate for countless others who are still searching for their truth. I am not the person I thought I was 72 years ago, but I am finally completely, authentically myself. 5 years have passed since the trial that exposed the elaborate deception that shaped the first 70 years of my life. As I write these words in my sunny kitchen, surrounded by photographs that represent verified truths rather than carefully constructed lies, I'm filled with a peace I never thought possible. My small apartment has become a sanctuary, not just for me, but for the growing community of adoptees, seniors, and truth seekers who have found hope in my story. The walls hold letters from people across the country who discovered the courage to demand answers about their own origins, to fight back against family members who were exploiting their vulnerabilities, or simply to live authentically rather than according to others' expectations. The relationships I've rebuilt with Lisa, Tom, and Emily have become deeper and more genuine than anything I experienced during the years when we were all playing roles rather than being ourselves. Lisa stops by twice a week, not out of duty, but because she enjoys our conversations about everything from current events to family history to our shared love of historical research. Tom and Emily bring their friends to meet the grandmother who taught them that fighting for truth is always worth the cost. Mark's journey toward redemption continues from a distance. His letters document genuine psychological growth and a slowly developing understanding of how fear and selfishness had corrupted his capacity for love. We may never have the close relationship we once shared, but we found a way to respect each other across the damage that was done. The work I do with my nonprofit organization has given my later years a purpose I never could have imagined. Every senior we help escape financial abuse, every adoptee we assist in finding their biological family, every family we guide toward transparency and honesty represents a victory against the forces of deception and exploitation that nearly destroyed me. The lesson I carry from this journey isn't about forgiveness or family loyalty or the power of perseverance, though all of those played their parts. It's about something more fundamental, the absolute necessity of knowing and claiming your authentic self, regardless of how painful that process might be or how many people might prefer the comfortable lies. For 70 years, I accepted a version of myself that had been created by others to serve their needs and protect their secrets. I defined my worth through my service to people who were willing to sacrifice my well-being to maintain their preferred narrative. When I finally demanded the truth about my own identity, I discovered that the cost of lies is always higher than the cost of honesty, no matter how devastating that honesty might initially appear. To anyone reading this who recognizes themselves in my story, anyone who suspects they've been living someone else's version of their life, anyone who's been told that demanding truth makes them difficult or ungrateful, anyone who's been convinced that their need for authenticity is less important than other people's comfort, I want you to know that it's never too late to reclaim your story. The truth about who you are, where you came from, and what has been done to you is not a luxury you must earn or a privilege others can grant or withhold. It's your fundamental right as a human being, and it's worth fighting for regardless of your age, your circumstances, or the power of the people who want to keep you from it. My life didn't really begin until I was 70 years old and discovered who I actually was beneath all the lies I had accepted as truth. That knowledge came at an enormous cost, but it also gave me something I had never experienced before: the unshakable peace that comes from living as yourself rather than as someone else's creation. I am Betty Sullivan Brennan Thompson, a name that represents the complex truth of my origins rather than the simple fiction I was raised to believe. I am 77 years old, and I am finally completely joyfully free. That freedom is available to anyone with the courage to demand it. The question isn't whether you deserve to know the truth about your own life. You do. The question is whether you're ready to fight for it.